food needs in our on our planet, and if you don't make an effort willingly, then we are going to force you to do so, so you realize that this is a true challenge. Now, the food challenge in the 21st century, what is it? This morning we discussed the demographic challenge, and I couldn't but ask Jean what his forecast was, and I still had the idea of a world population which would reach roughly 9 billion people around 2060. Perhaps it's going to happen earlier. But if today we're some 6.5 or 6.7 billion people, out of this number, there's roughly 1 billion in poverty and in food poverty. They're not necessarily starving. It's between malnutrition and starvation, but these people have very highly imbalanced food intake. And if we're 6.5 million human beings, 1 billion being suffering from malnutrition, now if we think that in 2 generations there will be roughly 9 billion people, and that we will have overcome poverty, that each and everybody will be able to eat according to his wishes and sufficiently. This means that if we now consider the changes in food intake, perhaps slightly increasing animal protein. And don't forget that in order to produce 1 animal protein, you need 3 vegetable protein. For 1 beef protein, you need 7 vegetable proteins. So the processing of the animals is very considerable, and therefore our challenge would be to be able to multiply by a factor 2 our agricultural production in order to be able to satisfy our food requirements and perhaps also our energy requirements, but that is a different issue, and I'm not quite sure of the rationale behind this. I think that the energy balance of ethanol based on corn, I'm not sure what this is, that this doesn't have a negative impact. But let's simply speak of the food balance, the food intake. And now a challenge, if we are to multiply or double the agricultural production, this would simply enable us to reply to the food demand. And how are we going to go about this? How are we going to double agricultural production on a world level? Well, the first reaction would be very simple. Let's increase the cultivated lands. Well, where's the problem? There isn't any, or at least there are still a number of terrains that we can use. In Cerrado in Brazil, they made the high plateau where there is cattle in these days. Now, obviously, the cattle you can't push cattle higher up to the Amazon basin, but there are probably a number of other areas in sub-Saharan Africa. However, the soil quality is not the best. But there's rarely any other area, and we also need to consider urban development. Urban development in a country such as China is taking up between 500,000 and 1 million hectares per year, simply because the Chinese cities are developing. And when these cities since these cities have a historical background, they are usually located in agricultural areas. When you arrive in Paris and Roissy, well, you land on the best possible agricultural lands in France, which have totally been taken away from any possible cultivation or agriculture. So let's simply look at the agricultural surfaces, and if they remain stable. Now, I must say that FAO tells us that there is a high potential here. Personally, I think that I'm rather skeptical. I believe that the remaining lands, I think that they are difficult soils. They are soils will give little production. They are eroded. I'm not sure. Perhaps you will also tell us about the Kazakh lands. I would like to know. And in the days of Khrushchev, there was much mentioned, and I'd like to see what happened there. Now, so if we simply decide to produce more, that may not be the best possible option. So we also need to consider the climate climate changes in some of the areas that are going to be concerned by more intensive droughts, and some other lands that would simply fall to the permafrost, and therefore I think that we need to look at it differently. So the second, if this is not an alternative, the other alternative the challenge is to multiply by a factor of 2 production. Now, how can we double the average production in our planet? Well, you can look at technological innovation, obviously, yes, that is, they play a major role, and we need to look into the development of biotechnologies, which are being used and applied to the crops. Now, they also give rise to a very strong reaction of our civil societies and its representatives. There will certainly be technical progress. There will certainly be further green revolutions. How and where and when are they going to happen? It will be interesting to look at this and see how India, for instance, handled its green revolution. It's a wonderful example. But one could say that with the constant, with this identical legal technology, we can still improve the situation. We could have a better management of the input. We could have a better management of the use of fertilizers, the plant fertilizers. Will they always be available? We even discussed the phosphates, and I mentioned phosphates simply because we're in Morocco and we're sitting on the largest world reserves in Morocco. We know that phosphate for the time being cannot be replaced, and at least not for the time being. And it would also be very interesting to discuss this. We need to look at the agricultural policies, because the best possible way to develop production is to guarantee agricultural producers interesting prices. And therefore Europe, which is totally in a deficit situation in '58 in Europe, has become one of the world exporters in agricultural products. So obviously the management of agricultural policies in emerging countries, but especially in developing countries, and especially in Africa, where from a demographic point of view, this is the highest challenge. So it's going to remain the highest challenge also in agricultural terms. And this is a real issue. How are we going to manage political policies, price guarantees? And it's a topic which has already been discussed during the 20th century, and perhaps we had believed that a solution had been found, but now it bounces back, and it is one of the major problems of the 21st century. And I'm going to stop there. I apologize if I spoke at length, but that is the privilege when you chair a meeting. I would simply like to insist, saying that, of course, it's very popular to speak on the climate challenges, more so than food challenges. However, I believe that for the 21st century, our major challenge will remain, just as was the case during the 18th century. Remember that the French Revolution was due to hunger, and it's which entailed the revolution, and the riots were due to the prevailing hunger in the population, and the last famine that existed was the Cultural Revolution, entailed the Cultural Revolution in China, except for some very extreme cases. The food challenge remains with us, and it is the major challenge which our humankind needs to face in the 21st century. So these are but a few ideas that I tossed out, and I would suggest to go beyond these very general observations now and very quickly go look into 2 case studies. And first of all, let's look at India. India is the second largest population, 1.3 or 1.4 billion people, if I'm not mistaken. And we didn't discuss the riots in India in 2008. India recently had poor crops, which entailed the surge in sugar prices. But India was able to maintain, ever since the Raj era, an agricultural policy aiming at the protection of small farmers. And if I'm not mistaken, India, during the first independence, there was an agricultural reform, a very fair redistribution. And I think the situation of India is a very interesting one. Just as today, India is also raising a number of other challenges. The number of Indian farmers committed suicide in order to protest the development and the use of genetically modified organisms. And therefore, I would like to turn to Mr. Toran. How do you see the situation? Now, I'm aware that you're a banker, first and foremost, but I would like to ask you how agricultural policy can be developed and where you find the funds to finance such a policy.